Well, as the rhetoric about Russian war crimes in Bucha, I think that's how you pronounce it. I think I mispronounced it yesterday, but I hope I got it right today, is heating up with State Department sponsored media outlets like the Washington Post claiming that Putin's accurate assessment of ridding Ukraine of Nazis was tantamount to his calls for genocide of Ukrainian people, even though those same Ukrainians in the Kiev army have been fighting alongside actual neo-Nazis while they were killing ethnic Russians and others in the Donbass, Luhansk, and Crimea regions for 8 years. You have to know that all of this nonsensical doublespeak by the U.S. imperialist regime has to be covering up something. Oh, of course, they're still covering up the Obama White House's coup in 2014 in Ukraine and the civil war that came after it, but there's something else. I have to state again that if Russian troops are found to have actually committed these atrocities, then yes, of course, they should be held accountable. But this government will do anything to hide from the public the fact that it armed, funded, and unleashed neo-Nazis on the people of Ukraine for years. So it is my job to never let you forget that. And it's also my job to tell you that while people are calling Putin pure evil and a war criminal behind these very thin, dubious, and suspect allegations of war crimes in Bucha, the U.S. government is considering expanding its permanent military bases to Eastern Europe. The head of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, said that the U.S. is considering the possibility of establishing permanent forward deployed bases in Eastern Europe to help bolster NATO. They would be staffed by rotating forces as opposed to having a permanent troop presence, he said, as if that makes the news of the U.S. expanding its already overwhelming 800 military bases around the world, as if that makes it more palatable and less deadly. It does not. And do we really believe that there won't be permanent troop deployments there? No, we do not. This news of potential new permanent U.S. military bases in Eastern Europe was reported yesterday way down in an hourly update article on Bloomberg.com. But the possibility of permanent troops deployed to that region was something that was talked about as early as March 1st of this year. The Biden administration's $6.4 billion request to Congress to respond to the Ukraine crisis at that time included $3.5 billion for the Pentagon to pay for operating costs associated with the surge to the current 100,000 troops in Europe or to its waters. Remember when Biden said no U.S. troops would be sent to Ukraine? Oh, and don't think that NATO is going to let its master, the U.S. government, act alone. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced last month that NATO is creating 4 new battle groups, which usually number between 1,000 and 1,500 troops to send to Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. General Milley agreed that Moscow's ongoing demands that the U.S. and NATO reduce troops and arms in European countries along Russia's borders signal a lengthy conflict in the region that extends beyond Ukraine. He said, I do think this is a very protracted conflict, and I think it's at least measured in years. I don't know about decades, but at least years for sure, said Milley. I think that NATO, the United States, Ukraine, and all of the allies and partners that are supporting Ukraine are going to be involved in this for quite some time. This was their plan all along, folks. This is what they don't want you to know. Putin's demands to not increase troops and move U.S. NATO weapons closer to Russia's border has been what every Russian leader has asked since the end of the Soviet Union, was promised by several U.S. presidents would not happen, and those promises were broken every single time. As much as one would argue that this conflict is about resources in Ukraine, and I think that might be true on the EU's part in particular, this is really about the US, EU, and NATO creating a launching pad for a protracted campaign to further weaken, if not completely destroy Russia, with an aim to attack China on one front. The propping up of Hong Kong and Taiwan is another front that the U.S. is using against China. But all of this chaos and death and war in Ukraine has been orchestrated by the U.S. government and its allies since at least 2014, all to expand U.S. military presence and permanence and U.S. dominance in Eastern Europe to ultimately challenge China. All of this could have been avoided decades ago by the U.S. and NATO not moving their forces into countries on Russia's border, former Warsaw Pact countries, former allies of the Soviet Union. But it definitely could have been avoided in January of this year when the Biden administration held talks with Russia to discuss those very troop deployments and military exercises and hardware being deployed and escalated in Eastern Europe. Initially, a current administration official and two former U.S. national security officials familiar with the planning of the meeting told NBC News that the Biden administration was ready to propose scaling back U.S. troops to ease tensions with Russia if they would agree to reduce their troops inside their own borders. But after the article was published, White House National Security spokesman Emily Horn disputed that the U.S. was considering reducing the number of troops permanently stationed in Poland and the Baltic states. Someone in this administration did want to avoid this, but not Biden. He wants his forever war, and he is willing to sacrifice Ukraine, the people of Bucha, and the truth to get it, just like his boss Obama, who started this particular imperialist mess back in 2014. And now you know why you haven't heard anything from him throughout this. He's sitting back sipping his mimosas, watching the world cheer for the neo-Nazis he armed and legitimized to pacify Ukraine to expand U.S. global hegemony and domination into Eastern Europe and the rest of the world. Now you know the whole hand they've been hiding. Follow Luke Mon Nation on patreon.com/LukeMonNation for lots of great content.